Hi everybody, I'm Bill Sanders and this is Watch Art Sci, the art and science of watch collection. Today what I want to do is that I want to take a look at two watch brands, Omega and Rolex. And these watches are generally considered excellent tool watches. In other words, these are watches that keep good time and you can wear them all over the place, and they're very robust, but they are competitive with each other. So let's take a look at them. By the way, I don't have a Rolex and I don't have an Omega, so I don't have a dog in this fight. All right, remember that. And I like them both. So it's one of those views of these watches. Now, number of years ago, I don't know, it must have been about 6, 7 years ago, Omega, as part of Swatch, and Patek Philippe and Rolex had something like a consortium of some sort and to make a silicone hairspring. And the reason they were interested in a silicone hairspring is that the engineers told them that this has all kinds of great properties. First of all, it is resistant to heat and cold. In other words, some hairsprings or balance springs, if they get too hot, they'll expand or they'll shrink if they're too cold, and this will throw off the timing. And silicon didn't do that. Wasn't affected like other kinds of metals were. Also, totally non-magnetic. It's one of those materials that magnetism just doesn't affect. And this is in terms of the Gauss, is that it has a very high Gauss rating, which means basically it's very non-magnetic. And there's some downsides to this. Comparatively speaking, silicon is fairly brittle, and so you can adjust it. In other words, you like on a curve regulator where you have one of those beautiful swan neck regulators, and you can make it go faster or slower with little adjustments, or your watchmaker can. And you can't do that with a silicone hairspring. You can adjust the weights that they have on the arms of the balance wheel. Right there you can see them, that they're sort of sticking out. Well, those aren't on the arms, those are on the side. Some of them are on the arms, and you screw those in or screw them out one way or the other, and that will adjust the balance. They're usually done at the factory when you get them. It's not something I would recommend anybody doing. But anyway, so once it's set up, the idea is that you have a nice, good balance. Also, too, it doesn't take any lubrication. So there are some nice advantages there. Okay, now another one. This is also by Omega. It's another Seamaster called the Diver 300 meters coaxial master chronometer, 42 millimeters. Now this one uses another movement by Omega called the 8800, and this one is considered a master chronometer. And the reason it's considered a master chronometer is it goes through two different kinds of testing. One is by COSC. Now, in order to be considered a chronometer, the watches have to go through some testing process. COSC is the most common one. There are other ones like Metis, and this is one that Omega uses. In Besançon, there's an observatory that they use. I think there's another one in Germany. But generally, the Swiss watches with COSC can put on their dial chronometer. All right. So this is a master chronometer, and that's because it's gone through both COSC and then went through 8 tests on Metas. Again, this one has a free sprung balance with a silicone balance spring. So this is sort of like super accurate as a master chronometer. At least that's what it's supposed to be. And as far as I know, that's probably, I have no reason to doubt that. Okay, now before we go on to take a look at some Rolexes, let's take a look at some kinds of metals that are used that are magnetic or non-magnetic. And they're classified into three categories: diamagnetic, paramagnetic, and ferromagnetic. The diamagnetic and the paramagnetic are not, they're very slightly affected by magnetic fields. And then once you pull them away from magnetic fields, they don't retain it. On the other hand, ferromagnetic ones do. So let's take a look at some of the materials. Diamagnetic include gold, copper, and silicon. Now we talked about silicon, and it's very non-magnetic. It has some though. It really does. I was surprised. I didn't think it had any, but it does have a little. Paramagnetic materials include titanium and niobium. We'll get to niobium in a second. Now, ferromagnetic, these have generally, it has some aspect of iron in them. The periodic table formula or symbol for iron is Fe, ferro, and that's where ferromagnetic comes from. And they can get magnetized. some of my watches got magnetized. I have this wonderful FP Journe chronomet Souverain. It gets magnetized every now and then, and I put it through a demag, and it's okay again. But apparently, there's something in there that's going to jam it up for a while, and it slows it down. Okay, other kinds of magnetism speed things up. So anyway, so both the diamagnetic and the paramagnetic materials are important. Niobium and titanium are used together in a hairspring called a Straussmann hairspring from H. Moser. I think they have their branch that does all of their R&D came up with it, and it's really something. Okay, so those are the metals that they have to deal with. Now, silicon, as I mentioned, the downside of silicon is it is brittle, and you can't change the shape in it. So whatever shape you got, you keep. It doesn't need any kind of lubricants. A lot of good things about it. Now, Rolex was one of the, as far as I know, was one of the early ones that came out. Really addressed Gauss in an important way, and they came out with a watch called the Milgauss, and 1,000 Gauss, which is, compared to 15,000 Gauss, it doesn't sound like much, but at least they were addressing that. And they've gone through, not only has Milgauss, but all of the watch movements in Rolex movements, and in particular their balance spring. They all now use, the men's watches use something that's called a blue parachrome balance spring. There it is down the lower right. This particular caliber, 3131, is used in the Milgauss. Now, this one has a magnetic shield around it. It's sort of, the shield is the magnetic, but it's supposed to block magnetism, and that protects the movement, in addition to having a niobium and zirconium and oxygen hairspring. You might remember that niobium was one of the paramagnetic metals that we looked at just a little while ago. Okay, so this was sort of the main anti-magnetic feature that was in and model in Rolex watches. The caliber 3131 is also used in the Air King, which happens to be my favorite, or one of my favorite Rolexes. I like that. I know it's not that popular, but I just think it's cool. So this is one that is, again, to addressing the whole issue of magnetism, and it's done with the Milgauss. Now, I mentioned when I talked about a consortium that was put together, some kind of deal with Swatch, Rolex, and Patek Philippe. This was working to have a silicone hairspring that they could all use. And how come they're not using silicone hairspring? And this is an interesting, to me, a very interesting thing. Rolex did have one that's called the Syloxi hairspring, and it's very interesting. They have a collet in the middle that goes around the balance shaft, and it grabs onto it. It's sort of like a little. The collet is like a little spring collar for it, and it holds it on so they can attach the hairspring. This is their silicone hairspring made of Syloxi, or it's called Syloxi, but it's essentially silicone. And what it does is that it can do it without any glue or anything else, and it's got I don't know why. I was very impressed with that. Just like you pop it on here and it's sort of like clips on. And why aren't they using this on the men's watches? Well, here you have two very different kinds of minimally magnetic, I'll put it that way, material, silicon, and then they have their parachrome with niobium and zirconium. And why one and not the other? Well, there's certain people like me, I suppose, and I've always associated silicon with computers. I used to write programs for those things, and also with quartz. Quartz is nothing but silicon and oxygen, all right? So it's people don't want a quartz watch. And so this was this more of a cultural thing. And you know, when you look back at Breguet and you look at the history of watchmaking and all of the watchmakers who are using different metals and spring, including even today, and the parachrome to me is just tip-top non-silicon, non-magnetic hairspring. So they do have it. So what are they doing with it? Well, what they decided to do was that they put it in women's watches, or at least some women's watches. This Rolex Datejust Pearlmaster 34 has a caliber 2236. I think the 2236 is the only movement that actually has the Syloxi hairsprings. All of the other ones have the blue parachrome hairspring. So this one, again, this is, and by the way, too, all of Rolex watches are chronometer certified. And I think all of them are the COSC. I don't think they have a master one yet, but those are how they deal with them. Now, here are the thoughts, okay, and I'll give them to you briefly. My thoughts, anyway, on silicon. I'd rather not have it, okay? With silicon, you cannot have a curve regulator. Now, I know curve regulators compared to free-sprung regulators, George Daniels and some others were sort of not too happy about the curve regulators, but they would not like silicon either. So it's one of those things. I think there's a little more flexibility. For example, even though the Rolex watches with the niobium and zirconium, the parachrome hairspring, they could have a curve regulator. They're free sprung, so that's a choice. But you don't have that choice with silicon. You do with some of these other ones. And in terms of the arguments of, well, this is progress in watchmaking. What's progress in watchmaking is your smartwatch. That's progress. Those of us who collect these, they're really sort of old-fashioned timekeeping devices. So more or less old-fashioned, I suppose, for those of us who would prefer not to have silicon versus those who say, look, I want an accurate watch and it's got everything else about it. The The glass on here is made from synthetic sapphires. All of the jewels are synthetic in watches today. Not the ones perhaps that decorate it like on this one, but um, there's a lot of things that didn't exist during Breguet's day. I would really like to hear your thoughts on silicon as hairspring in watches, whether you're okay with it, whether it's something you'd rather not see. And so in the comments section, I'd like to hear what you think about that. This is also an opportunity to subscribe if you like. Till next time, this is Bill Sanders for Watch Art Sci, the art and science of watch collection.